Square Enix is a legendary video game producer and developer, most renowned for their Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest franchises. In recent years, however, their track record has been much spottier. For every acclaimed title like Octopath Traveler or Nier Automata, they've had a half dozen or so stinkers, like The Quiet Man, Ballin' Wonderworld, and Babylon's Fall. What's more is that even some of their biggest games like Final Fantasy XVI and Kingdom Hearts 3 haven't lived up to the company's lofty sales projections, making it difficult to celebrate any successes they may achieve. So many of their titles, too, have fallen into that unfortunate middle range between a disaster and a blockbuster, meaning that they can't even gain notoriety for being a failure like Ballin' Wonderworld has. Forspoken is one such game that initially got a big push from Square Enix, only for it to have a lukewarm reception from consumers and critics, and thus, over the past year, it has faded into near obscurity despite the big names attached and a large marketing campaign. Fortunately for us, that makes it an ideal candidate for this edition of Trash or Treasure. Is Forspoken really as middling as its reputation would have you believe, or is there a hidden gem hiding there in plain sight? Let's find out. But before we begin, please take a moment to consider casting a subscribe spell on my channel, summoning a like attack on this video, and conjuring a bell notification so you can stay up to date on all of my content. Okay, let's dive into the world of Forspoken. Forspoken was developed by Luminous Productions, a studio spun off from Square Enix Business Division 2, after that team grew too large during the development of Final Fantasy XV. Most members of Luminous Productions assisted in finishing the 15th mainline Final Fantasy title while beginning production on what would end up being their first and only game, Forspoken. The game first made headlines for its writing staff, which includes the talents of Amy Hennig and Gary Whitta. Hennig first rose to prominence with her work in the Legacy of Kain franchise, specifically being the writer and director for Soul Reaver, Soul Reaver 2, and Defiance. She then joined Naughty Dog, directing Jak 3, before being the lead writer and director for the first 3 Uncharted titles. Whitta also is a veteran in the industry, being the co-writer for 2006's Prey and the first season of Telltale's The Walking Dead, as well as contributing to the Gears of War franchise. In the realm of films, Whitta served as a writer for the movies The Book of Eli, After Earth, and co-creating the story for Rogue One, a Star Wars story. Forspoken follows Alfre Frey Holland, a young woman living a rough life in present-day New York City. As an infant, she was found abandoned at the Holland Tunnel on Christmas Day and spent most of her youth in and out of foster homes and frequent encounters with law enforcement. Frey is struggling to turn her life around, and after losing what little she has in a fire and narrowly escaping death by a gang that she has wronged, she feels completely hopeless at making things better for herself. Wishing for a way to escape all of her hardships, Frey returns to the Holland Tunnel on her birthday for a moment of reflection. There she spies a curious glowing bird flying near her. Following it through an open window, Frey is drawn to a mysterious vambrace, and upon picking it up, she is transported to another world. In the fantasy realm of Athia, Frey learns that this magical bangle is actually sentient, speaking to her telepathically. Thus she affectionately calls him Cuff. Cuff also seemingly grants her magical abilities, letting her cast spells on a whim and have the agility like that of a mystical cat. All is not well in Athia, however, as a disturbing presence known as the Break has wiped out most of humanity, leaving only the central city of Sepal left standing. All those unfortunate to have been caught outside of Sepal's walls have been consumed by vile beasts that terrorize the landscape, or transformed into shambling zombies. What's more is that Athia's 4 benevolent rulers, sorceresses called Tantas, have gone mad, and the once loving protectors now punish those that seek to depose them. Frey, possessing powers similar to that of the Tantas, as well as an immunity to the effects of the break, begrudgingly decides to risk her life to save the people of Athia, even as many reject her out of fear of what this woman from another world may bring. Despite having such notable talent to craft the story of Forspoken, a lot of criticism can be levied specifically at the quality of writing in this game's world. While it offers an interesting premise, it doesn't stray far from the standard isekai genre of a protagonist being trapped in a foreign, hostile world. Many of the genre tropes are here, from the fish out of water becoming an almighty savior, to the protagonist having some sort of connection to the fantasy world all along. So if you're expecting something wholly new, and you're familiar with Eastern stories such as Inuyasha, Sword Art Online, Spirited Away, or Western examples like The Matrix, Alice in Wonderland, or The Wizard of Oz, then you're going to be disappointed. I will say that despite the vast majority of the plot following predictable paces, there was one twist towards the end that I didn't see coming. It does inject some fresh life into the story, juicing it up from being rather ho-hum to actually motivating you to follow through to the end, and it adds some subtle tweaks to the gameplay if only temporarily. Unfortunately, the game doesn't stick the landing, as any repercussions that this twist has on the final are glossed over during the end game. This is where a sequel is actually quite warranted, as the game sets up the scenarios in the world to have a pretty interesting dynamic in any potential follow-ups. Sadly, due to the critical and commercial receptions Forspoken had, a sequel game is all but an impossibility. The story is also quite brief for an open-world RPG. The opening chapters are filled with exposition, character introductions, and world building, almost to the point that it's too much, and it detracts from the actual gameplay. After reaching the first Tanta, though, a lot of the storytelling goes out the window, and the player is quickly ushered from one plot point to the next, in what can feel like a sprint to the end. The story picks right back up in the closing hours, but can seem too little, too late, after enduring a narrative drought in the middle. Early previews of the game also showcase some rather clumsy and sophomoric dialogue, primarily from the protagonist, Frey. A lot of her dialogue consists of one-liners and modern-day lingo, reminiscent of how characters speak in a Joss Whedon production, or the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In small doses, this can be fun, but I think most audiences are tired of this writing style due to overexposure and prefer something much more grounded. Cursing is also a big part of the dialogue in Forspoken. It's notable that most everyone in the game speaks with some elegance, as if they've been plucked from a mystical fantasy realm that the game portrays, except for Frey, who spews as many curse words as she does quippy one-liners. I understand that it's a technique to further separate her from the people of Athia, and to establish her from-the-streets background, but I also contend that not every game needs to have a flurry of F-bombs. Mature writing can tackle tough subjects without forcing words that are censored in most settings. Perhaps the biggest sin of the dialogue, though, is that it simply never stops. I'm all for party chatters. It can really be immersive and a great way to display the personalities of each character, but when there are only 2 characters through the majority of the game, and those lines of dialogue are repeated ad nauseum, you'll quickly be begging for silence. It seems every single action Frey takes coaxes a comment from either she or Kofi, and this gets old fast. Aside from the dialogue, most previews of Forspoken highlighted its impressive graphics, and for good reason. The world of Athia can be beautiful to look at, with some photorealistic landscapes and abandoned settlements, as well as fantastical regions of ominous floating isles, fields of bright flowers, and gorgeous mountains. It's very regrettable that the first realm you explore is undeniably the most boring, as it's nothing but a rocky wasteland, largely devoid of any notable plant life or unique elements. The game even pokes fun at this by having Frey proclaim at times while exploring how this area is nothing but rocks, and more rocks, which is a huge disservice to areas the player can explore later in the adventure. While the majority of the open world can be lovely to look at, exploring it can be tedious. Forspoken falls into the open world trap of having the same few objectives repeated throughout. Towers that uncover portions of the map, settlements that need clearing of baddies, time challenges that have you sprinting across the countryside, unique monsters that need slaying, and treasure chests galore. The problem is that while there's some variety in the tasks that need to be completed, there's no variety within these confined scenarios. Case in point, scattered across the world are these cat statues, and reaching them activates a short mini-game where you sneak up on these mystical felines and befriend them. The issue is, all 24 of these play out almost exactly the same, with the exception of maybe 2 or 3. Another example comes from these little dungeons. Although they aren't complete duplicates of each other, they all consist of large, bland rooms filled with enemies connected by boring hallways. The silver lining is that they do culminate into a fun boss fight, but it still doesn't keep these from feeling like cut and paste copies of each other after the first few. A final example comes from these sliding lock puzzles, also known as a gamer's favorite minigame. I don't detest these as much as some people do, but if you really have an affliction for solving these, then Forspoken is probably not the game for you. Some treasure chests and doors you encounter will be locked, and you'll be forced to solve these in order to access the guarded contents. Because there are literally hundreds of these puzzles in the game, most of them can quickly be solved in only a couple of moves. Seriously, the vast majority are made so that a toddler could even break the code in a matter of seconds, which makes me wonder about how secure Althea's liquor cabinets are. Some will make you pause to think though, but the point stands that instead of having a variety of brain teasers to test your mettle on, these mundane puzzles seem to exist simply because they had to have something there. Sometimes you'll encounter break storms in your travels, which exist simply to ruin almost any fun you're having discovering the realm of Althea. These storms darken the sky, shroud your surroundings, and summon a near-endless horde of supercharged enemies to impede your way. Most of these are placed in key locations on the map that you need to complete a task to clear, but most storms appear randomly and bring your adventuring to a sudden stop. I swear, these are more annoying than rain in Breath of the Wild. The developers have at least attempted to make simple traversal entertaining with the use of a magical parkour system, allowing Frey to dash across entire fields in seconds, or bound up cliffs with ease. Most of this is done impressively, with the use of only a couple of button presses, though I will say it's not nearly as impressive as it probably should be, considering most every open world game these days seems to involve parkour, and the novelty is certainly wearing thin, at least for me. Combat is Forspoken's forte, and for the most part, the developers have succeeded in delivering a compelling action title. Forspoken feels a lot like another big 2023 title from Square Enix, Final Fantasy XVI, in that you have access to a large variety of actions all linked to element-based weapons that you can switch between on the fly. However, whereas Final Fantasy XVI relied almost entirely on melee combat, with a weak emphasis on magic casting, Forspoken is quite the opposite, with your spells being behind most of your moves, and melee taking a back seat. At the outset, you'll only have governance over earth magic, but as you defeat each Tanta, you'll gain mastery over the elements of fire, water, and light as well. Each elemental skill set has a little over a dozen spells to unlock, giving you new power moves to pull off in combat, or passive abilities that make Frey even stronger, and some crafting abilities that aid you in making better gear. Each of your magic sets has 3 modes of standard attack, typically consisting of a mix of heavy-hitting close-ranged attacks, quick yet weaker long-ranged moves, and a strong area of attack blast. While sharing some similarities with one another across weapon sets, most all of these attacks can feel unique and purposeful during certain encounters. Players are encouraged to change up tactics routinely, and it keeps the combat feeling fresh for the majority of the adventure. For example, one earth magic spell brings up a sturdy shield that can protect Frey from oncoming attacks, and then she can release it, causing a shotgun-like blast that can break the defenses of foes up close. Another earth spell is the Scatter Shot, which sends a flurry of small pebbles at an enemy with pinpoint precision, which can quickly drain the health of a single bad guy. The third earth magic attack sends a sturdy rock forward, which then explodes, dealing moderate damage to any enemies nearby. In addition to your standard attacks, you have a bevy of support spells at your disposal, each of which requires a cooldown period after use. These are much more powerful than your standard moves, though they can be more situational in how they're utilized. For instance, one spell engulfs the area surrounding Frey with pillars of fire, boosting the attack damage within the arena and damaging any enemies that get near to the flaming walls. The Obelette is a water spell that traps enemies within a large ball of water, and attacking it will cause it to explode, dealing serious splash damage to all of those nearby. Some spells have a greater chance of stunning an adversary, while a few others will deal additional damage to enemies that are stunned. I like that there's a wide variety of spells in your arsenal, as it can really make you feel like an all-powerful mage. Alas, the sheer amount of spells available by the end of the game makes it extremely hard to find the right ability to use at the most opportune time. You may be able to stun an enemy, for example, but cycling through your spells for one to take advantage of that before they stand up is nearly impossible due to combat not pausing while you look for what you need. This rings especially true for the more defensive-minded abilities, which are best used quickly. Assume you are hit with a debuff that slows Frey's stamina recovery. You first have to switch to your water magic if you don't already have it equipped, then cycle through your support spells until you find the one out of a dozen that cures you of that debuff. By the time you accomplish this, you may have shook off the ill effects naturally. It's instances like this that make me yearn for a better method of mapping out these spells. Instead of assigning a single button to cast all support spells, perhaps the developers should have allowed us to map them to certain buttons for quicker casting. Most all spells can be upgraded, but only if the player can complete the challenge for that spell. These are pretty straightforward and may require the player to vanquish a certain amount of foes with that spell or use it in certain situations, like when an enemy is stunned. I kind of like this method as opposed to the more traditional way of leveling up your abilities, though I did find the majority of challenges to be so easy that they felt like busy work. While Forspoken excels as an action game, it falls just short of being an RPG. The game provides many different ways to customize Frey to your liking. Frey possesses a few stats that you can increase, but are rather rudimentary. Health and defense are self-explanatory, while stamina is used for evading and performing parkour moves, and healing determines how much vitality is restored when using a healing item. Then you have stats that determine your proficiency in each of the elemental schools of magic. A high stat in red magic means that fire spells hit harder, and so on. When you defeat enemies and complete quests, you'll gain experience points and eventually level up. However, leveling up only provides you with a boon of mana points that are used to unlock spells and do not increase your stats as one might think. Instead, your stats are completely determined by the items that you equip Frey with, and what's more is that Frey can only wear one cloak and one necklace at a time. Each cloak and necklace you collect will have a unique trait to them, as well as their own stat levels. This may seem limiting at first, but you'll soon realize that any and all equipment can be customized to your liking by the end of the game. By gathering items in your travels, you can change the traits of your equipment and upgrade them to have maximum stats. That way, you can wear whichever gear you think looks best. I don't know if I like this method. I think it's cool that you aren't stuck wearing something completely ugly just because it has high stats, but at the same time, I think the freedom to customize can negate the unique aspects of these items, thus diminishing the importance of finding rare loot. I also don't like that leveling up simply serves to give you currency to purchase more abilities, in part because mana points can be found in abundance while exploring the world. Athia is positively littered with these blue wisps near the ground, with each one giving you a single mana point. I know that the developers are attempting to reward players who choose to either explore or engage in battle, but as long as you're not rushing through the experience, you're going to learn every ability the game has to offer before the end, and at that point, both combat and exploration lose their impact. Frey can also equip magical nail polish, which can give her passive boosts, such as increasing the damage of support spells, letting killer blows produce a shockwave, or providing additional health when using an item. These cannot be customized, but players can choose to either wear different polish on each hand, or stack their effects by applying them to both sets of nails. This is a neat concept that more fits with the game's theme, I think, than the more traditional rings, boots, and other accessories. Forspoken's soundtrack is composed by both Bear McCreary and Gary Shyman. McCreary is noteworthy across film, television, and video games, producing some acclaimed award-winning work for Battlestar Galactica, Black Sails, The Lord of the Rings of Power, and 2018's God of War and its sequel, Ragnarok. Shyman has also had success across all forms of media, though he may be best known for providing the music for the video games Destroy All Humans, BioShock, and the Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War games. Their work with Forspoken is a lot like the work the writing team has produced. Small glimmers of brilliance, but largely forgettable. The composers have wisely decided to fuse the epic brassy sounds that dominate the fantasy genre with modern-day trap beats, which helps further tell the story of a New Yorker from the 21st century now living in a world composed of high castles and dragons. The soundtrack is undoubtedly beautiful, but sadly, not much stayed with me after the credits rolled. The voice acting is a high point, as the actors do a convincing job selling their lines, even when they aren't particularly the best written. Ella Balinska is a wonderful Frey, and almost all of my qualms with the character come from how she's written and not how she's acted. Other standouts include Monica Barbaro as Auden, one of Frey's first allies in Athia, Janina Gavankar as the vicious Tanta Sila, and Deborah Wilson as Councilwoman Belette Crow. Jonathan Cake as Cuff, however, steals the show, as his masterful delivery of Frey's magical armband shows great range, allowing such a simply conceived character to be deceivingly deep, where Cuff can at times be a comic relief companion, a constructive mentor, and even a challenging rival. Forspoken has one paid DLC that continues the story, although it only provides a few answers to the questions one might have after the credits roll. In this story, titled In Tanta We Trust, Frey follows a mysterious voice that guides her back in time to witness a war that occurred some 20 years prior to the events of the main game. Here, Frey wakes up inside the body of a soldier named Talia and experiences the events through her eyes. Shortly after awaking, Talia is taken prisoner by the enemy and is bestowed a curse, but is soon rescued by Tanta Senta. During their escape, Talia learns that she can now cast spells, many of which are similar but not identical to the ones Frey can use, and with this newfound power, she and Tanta vow to stop the opposing army once and for all. The campaign here is rather short, consisting of around 2 to 4 hours of playtime and a small open map for you to explore and complete a handful of quests. Most of the gameplay is the same. Although Talia doesn't have the exact same abilities as Frey, most of them are similar enough that you'll find them familiar. There are a few new abilities, though, that center around crystallizing enemies for longer stuns or setting them up for major damage. The biggest addition by far is teaming up with Tanta. With no Cuff this go around, Cinta acts as your companion, providing fresh commentary while also assisting in battle. Crystallizing enemies will allow Cinta to follow up with an attack of her own if given the command, and chaining 3 of these together will let Cinta pull off a devastating finisher. Cinta also acts as a support, summoning a shield when Talia is low on health, for example. All of this works to breathe new life into the combat system, which may have grown stale for players who have already seen everything else within the main game. One of the biggest shortcomings of the DLC, though, is that you cannot transfer any progress from the main game over, so players that have become ultra powerful as Frey are going to feel pretty weak as Talia, even after she's learned everything that she can. The plot also doesn't reveal enough new information to satisfy most gamers. This may be different had the game sold well and a sequel is to be expected, but considering a new Forspoken game is likely just a dream at this point, the DLC just doesn't cut it as a way to cap off the tale. Not enough questions are answered, too many new questions arise, and the overall length of the tale is simply an appetizer for a main course that, truthfully, isn't coming. Forspoken is far from a trash game, but it doesn't shine enough to be treasure either. It sits in that rare place of being firmly in the middle. While it can be an exciting and well-made action title, its shortcomings in the open world and RPG realms weigh it down. Forspoken is a stunning game visually and is delightful to the ears too, but the writing and overall plot will leave you wanting and never truly satisfied. For these reasons, along with the almost certainty that a sequel isn't coming to tie up all the loose ends left after the credits roll, I would say that Forspoken is a title one can easily skip, unless they have played to completion all other open-world action RPGs and are starved for yet another.